A clay tablet sits near a kiln in the harbor quarter of Ugarit, the coast of Syria, approximately 1185 BCE. It is a letter, the last, from the city's king, a man named Hammurabi, addressed to the king of Cyprus. It begs for ships, for soldiers. "My cities were burned," it reads. "The enemy's ships came here." Hammurabi had spent his final weeks writing to everyone. Cyprus, the Hittites, the Egyptians. Letters begging for grain, letters begging for fleets. He was a man at the center of the richest trading network on Earth, calling out to every node in the web, and hearing nothing back. No reply was ever sent. The fire now consuming Ugarit would bake his tablet into permanence, the last words of a king who died waiting for a world that had already collapsed around him. Within a generation, Ugarit was gone, not conquered, erased. The harbor silted over. The city would not be found for 3,000 years. The standard explanation has always been simple. Mysterious raiders called the Sea Peoples swept through the Mediterranean and destroyed everything. A clean story, a villain you can name. I'm Marcus. Today, we're not retelling that story. We're following the evidence. Because the first globalized world did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was strong, so perfectly interconnected that the trade links which made everyone rich became the wires down which the catastrophe traveled. To understand how that world died, you have to see what it was. By the 14th century BCE, something extraordinary had taken shape around the eastern Mediterranean. A handful of great powers, Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece, Babylonia, Assyria, the Kingdom of Mitanni, and the city-states of Canaan and Cyprus, had locked themselves into a web of mutual dependence so tight that no kingdom could function without the others. Historians sometimes call them the Bronze Age G8, and the comparison with the modern world is not casual. For the sheer density of diplomatic and commercial entanglement between these states, relative to the number of players, the ancient world would not see anything like it again for over 2,000 years. They called each other brother. Egyptian pharaohs sent gold to Hittite kings and received silver in return. Hittite queens rode to Egyptian courts asking for physicians. Royal daughters were married across borders to seal treaties. And when the daughters died under unclear circumstances, the letters between palaces turned cold and sharp. Gold, lapis lazuli, and carved ivory moved in diplomatic caravans that were, in practice, trade. We know the texture of this world because they could not stop writing to each other. The Amarna letters, roughly 350 clay tablets found in a ruined Egyptian palace, are the diplomatic archive of the 14th century BCE, and they read like an inbox that swings between ceremony and fury. Kings complain about the quality of gold they received. They accuse each other of insult. They remind each other of debts owed in the same breath as a veiled threat. Beneath the protocol runs a single constant: need. Egypt needed Hittite grain and Babylonian lapis lazuli. The Hittites needed Egyptian gold. Everyone needed Cypriot copper. And everyone, without exception, needed tin. It was not friendship, it was lock-in. And for roughly 2 centuries, it worked. Trade expanded, wealth accumulated, cities grew. The system rewarded those who connected and punished those who withdrew. And it had been designed, if designed is even the word, entirely for prosperity. No one had built it to survive a crisis, because for 200 years, no crisis had come. The trade routes stretched further than most people realize. Egyptian gold moved north. Cypriot copper moved in every direction. Tens of thousands of ox-hide-shaped ingots, the standardized unit of exchange across the Bronze Age world. Mycenaean olive oil, fine pottery, and perfumed unguents traveled by sea to Egypt and overland across the Levant. Baltic amber, harvested on the shores of what is now Poland, reached Aegean workshops through overland routes that crossed an entire continent. Afghan lapis lazuli and tin passed through Mesopotamian middlemen. Nubian ebony and elephant ivory came up the Nile. Canaanite resins and dyes moved along the coast. Every kingdom had something another kingdom needed. Egypt had gold but scarce timber. The Levant had timber but depended on Anatolian grain. Anatolia had grain but needed Cypriot copper. Cyprus had copper but needed Afghan tin. None was self-sufficient. There was no backup supplier, no secondary route, no reserve. The web had been optimized in the way that elegant systems always are, for the conditions that already existed. At the center of this web, the switchboard, sat Ugarit. Not a great power, no vast army or territory. What it had was position, a harbor on the Syrian coast between the empires, operating in at least 7 languages, brokering deals that connected civilizations which could barely speak to each other. Its harbor quarter smelled of terebinth resin and copper dust and foreign wool, and it grew enormously rich on the margin. A small city doing the work of a continent. This was, in a real sense, the first globalization. Not in geographic reach, the distances were modest by modern standards, but in logic. A world in which every part depended on every other part, and the failure of one would become the problem of all. For 200 years, the ships sailed, the tin arrived, and the network held. The key to everything was tin. To make bronze, and bronze was the material that armed every army, ran every palace, and held every ship together in this world, you alloy copper with roughly 10% tin. Without it, copper is too soft to hold a sword's edge or bear a chariot's weight. With it, you get the metal that built the age. Copper was abundant. Cyprus alone produced staggering quantities. But tin was rare. Desperately, structurally rare. And the nearest major source lay in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, roughly 2,000 miles from the Mediterranean forges that consumed it. A British archaeologist once put it simply, their need for tin was our need for oil. He was not being poetic. He was describing the same vulnerability. Every weapon, every tool, every chariot fitting, every economy that ran on bronze, and that was all of them, depended on a single commodity, hauled along routes that crossed multiple kingdoms and seas, controlled end-to-end by no one. Sever those routes, and every state in the network loses its military and economic foundation. Not over years, within a season. In the 1980s, a Turkish sponge diver found something off the coast of Uluburun in southern Turkey, a merchant shipwreck from approximately 1320 BCE. It predates the collapse by over a century. But what lay on the seabed was the Bronze Age economy in a single frame. 10 tons of Cypriot copper cast into ox-hide ingots, 1 ton of tin, ebony from Nubia, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, ostrich eggshells, delicate luxury goods bound for someone's table in a distant city, Baltic amber that had crossed Europe by land before being loaded onto a Mediterranean hull, Canaanite jars of terebinth resin, Mycenaean swords and fine pottery, and 1 small gold scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti. 7 cultures, 1 hull. No written manifest survived. The merchant class of this world left almost no readable prose. The Mycenaeans kept linear bee inventories in their palaces. The Ugaritic scribes recorded diplomacy and ritual. But the traders themselves are ghosts. The cargo speaks where words do not. I find it one of history's small mercies that when a civilization leaves no literature, it sometimes leaves its luggage. The Uluburun ship was not unusual. It was the network, working as designed, and a portrait of everything that was about to be lost. And the network was already failing before any invader appeared. By the late 13th century BCE, the Hittite royal archives, which had recorded generations of confident diplomacy and military conquest, begin to fill with a different kind of letter. A Hittite queen writes to the court of Ramses II, requesting an emergency grain shipment. She calls it a matter of life and death. Other letters beg Ugarit, the wealthy broker, to send grain north to the Hittite heartland. The protocol is gone. What remains is the sound of a superpower starving from the inside. The Hittites were no minor kingdom. Their empire covered most of Anatolia. They had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh and signed what may be the oldest surviving peace treaty in history. And now they were begging their own trade partners for food. In 2023, a team led by the dendrochronologist Sturt Manning published findings in Nature that may have identified why. Juniper tree rings from Gordion in central Turkey record 3 consecutive years of catastrophic drought, roughly 1198 to 1196 BCE. Not one bad season, 3 back-to-back. In a region where farming ran on rainfall, not river irrigation, 3 consecutive failures was an extinction event for the grain economy. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, a city of massive stone walls and carved gate lions, home to one of the greatest royal archives of the ancient world, was abandoned. Not sacked, not burned by enemies, left. The royal line vanished, the grain was gone, and the people walked into the Anatolian countryside without looking back. The sound that hung over those final seasons was not battle. It was the creak of empty storerooms and the silence where letters used to arrive. And then came the Sea Peoples. At the mortuary temple of Medinet Habu in southern Egypt, Ramesses III carved a record of what happened in his 8th regnal year, approximately 1177 BCE. The date Eric Klein would later choose as the symbolic marker for the entire collapse. On the walls, in vivid painted relief, a great naval and land battle. Foreign warriors in feathered or horned headdresses. Ox carts loaded with women and children. This was not a raid, it was a migration. Long swords and round shields crashing against Egyptian archers on the shore. Ramses claims total victory. "Those who reached my border," he proclaims, "their seed is no more." It is an impressive monument. It is also, almost certainly, inflated. Pharaohs did not carve their defeats into stone, and Egypt, while it survived the encounter, was never the same. Within decades, the new kingdom fractured into a decline that would last centuries. I think Ramesses believed his own inscription. Victors usually do. But the Sea People's story has a problem, and it is fatal. It only works if you stop asking questions. Who were these people? The Egyptian texts list names: Peleset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, but never explain origins. The Aegean, Anatolia, several places at once? And why did they move, armed, desperate, hauling their families and livestock, at precisely the moment when every kingdom around them was also collapsing? Why did civilizations from Greece to Mesopotamia fall in the same generation when most of them never encountered a sea person at all? This is where the evidence turns the familiar story inside out. Did the Sea Peoples destroy the Bronze Age? Of course not. No single enemy, however fierce, could explain why every major power across 1,000 miles of coastline collapsed within a single lifetime. What the evidence now suggests, and what Klein's updated work makes the strongest case for, is that the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse. They were born from it. Displaced populations, many of them driven by the same drought and famine that was already hollowing out the Hittite heartland and straining every grain supply from Anatolia to the Nile Delta. They moved because their own world had already failed. They brought families, animals, everything they owned on ox carts because they were not going back. And when they reached the shores of kingdoms that were themselves already weakened, already running on empty granaries and fraying supply lines, the result was not an invasion that shattered a healthy world. It was the last blow to a world that could no longer absorb any blow at all. What followed moved like a contagion, and it traveled the same routes that had once carried wealth. When the Hittite heartland went dark, the grain convoys and overland trade roads that crossed its territory stopped. The coastal cities that had depended on that grain and on the tin caravans transiting Hittite lands, Ugarit above all, suddenly had neither food nor the metal that ran their economies. Ugarit's harbor, which had hummed in 7 languages, fell quiet. Then it burned. When Ugarit fell, the web lost its switchboard. The port through which much of the eastern Mediterranean's commerce had been brokered was gone. Trade between Egypt and the Aegean slowed to a trickle. The Mycenaean palaces, which had financed elaborate bureaucracies on the surplus of long-distance exchange, began to starve. At Pylos, the palace burned so completely that archaeologists found its linear B tablets baked solid in the rubble, the last inventory of a kingdom that had run out of things to count. One by one, the lights went out across the map. Not because a single army marched from city to city, but because each node had been kept alive by neighbors that were already gone. The same connections that had carried prosperity in good years now carried ruin. Every efficiency that had made the Bronze Age rich, the specialization, the just-in-time dependence on Afghan tin, the stripping away of local alternatives in the name of growth, became lethal the moment conditions overwhelmed the web's ability to compensate. And by the time anyone understood what was happening, there was nothing left to compensate with. And in Ugarit, Amurapi, a king who spent his last days calling out to every ally in the network and hearing only silence, had one final letter to Cyprus still sitting near the kiln. He had asked for ships. Cyprus had none to send. The letter was never dispatched, and the fire that ended his city preserved his words. The last testament of a world that believed until the very end that the network would hold. It did not. What followed was a darkness so total it is difficult to overstate. For 300 to 500 years, longer than the entire span between our time and the voyages of Columbus, the Eastern Mediterranean entered what scholars call a dark age. International trade collapsed, diplomatic letters ceased, cities were abandoned, their populations scattered into small, isolated settlements living at subsistence. The palace economies that had organized production, storage, and exchange for centuries simply vanished. And the most staggering loss was not material. Writing itself died. The Mycenaean Greeks had used a script called Linear B to administer their palace bureaucracies. Tallies of grain and bronze, records of sheep and oil and tribute. When the palaces burned and the systems they served disappeared, no one needed the script. Within a generation, it was forgotten. Greece would have no writing system at all for roughly 400 years, until the Phoenician alphabet arrived around 800 BC. A civilization did not merely decline, it forgot how to read. What survives today? The ruins of Ugarit, half excavated on a quiet Syrian hillside. The stone lions of Hattusa still guarding a gate that opens onto nothing. Cyclopean walls at Mycenae, built so massively that later Greeks believed only giants could have raised them. And in a museum in Ankara, a small clay tablet. The letter Hammurabi never sent, still legible after 32 centuries. Still asking for help that never came. What survives invisibly is harder to sit with. We inherited the world the Bronze Age invented, the world of long-distance interdependence. Our own supply chains are longer, thinner, and faster than theirs ever were. We move goods across oceans in days, not months. We have concentrated microchip fabrication on a single island and rare earth processing in a single country. And we have built into our global systems the same quiet assumption that Ugarit, Hattusa, and Mycenae once built into theirs, that the network will hold, because it always has. The Bronze Age believed that too. For 200 years, they were right. Tell me in the comments, our world runs on supply chains thinner than theirs ever were. Could 1177 BC happen to us? And which civilization should we reconstruct next? See you among the ruins.